Good evening, history friends, and welcome to this AP World CRAM session. This is number 7, but we still have 4 to go before the exam, so there is plenty of time. People could drop a little hello or maybe a nice emoji of a world history variety into the chat so I know that you can hear me. Can you hear me, Sri Devi? I appreciate the hey. That is very good. It's always kind of an act of faith. It's always an act of faith that this is working. So if you could say hello, I would appreciate it. Oh yeah, the one-humped camel, Arabian, right? Trans-Saharan variety. Thanks, Mrs. Longnecker. That is great. Oh boy. Yeah, Snigda looking, going big, right? That's going to be 20th century. We're not going to get to that, but we might be able to glimpse it from here. So I have a few things going on. The chat should be pretty lively tonight. So if you have a question that you would like answered for sure, you should go ahead and put it and ask a question. I am especially going to concentrate on questions related to thesis and essay structure and on industrialization. So we're going to have more people tonight, as you might see, and so I may not be able to get to as many questions as usual, but we have a great team here. So I think I will switch my size with the slides and then we can talk. So, but do go ahead and put things and ask a question and upvote. And you might notice the more votes, it floats up to the top, and then I'll see it and be able to, and I'll be more likely to respond on screen. So here we go. Cool. All right. There are no more free sessions because we're in AP week. Has anyone taken an AP exam this week? It'd be something that's happening. Usually we have that, free streams on these night slides. But for us, we have, after tonight, 3 more CRAM sessions. And 2 of them will be like this one where we do some skill work and look at one of the, or 2 key concepts. And then a week from Wednesday, 5 hours of power leading up to the exam. So good times. There'll be Jed and Charlie will be on for the first couple hours talking about content and asking questions. And there'll be a trivia break. And then I'll be on live with an Ask Me Anything kind of a deal. Well, at least in regard to world history. So we'll do that. Keep track of what's happening using the social media. That way you can share it with others. All right, so here's tonight's starter document. Just take a look at this here for a second and see what kinds of things with a chart like this, it might take a moment to get an understanding of what it's even showing. So one of the things I do when I see a chart like this is when it says percent, I mean that I know that then going one way or the other should add up to 100% or close with rounding. So then you want to see in a history chart, does it show change over time? So if it only shows one thing, is that different from before, or is it similar? Or if it shows multiple times like this one, does it show change over time? So what's the context that's happening here? Yep, Vishal has that. Vishal, are you coming in from Japan? I just noticed that in your CRAM contest bio thing. I mean, for the other youth out there, I would like to point out that it is tomorrow in Japan. So he's coming to us from the future. Or she, I guess I wouldn't. They? Welcome, Vishal. I really appreciate what you are bringing to the table here. Anyone else coming in internationally? Because that is such a good thing in the world history. I know we've had India and Korea and Vietnam, Hong Kong in our streams. So yeah. So the Industrial Revolution. Okay, now let's take it up a notch from there. That's right, because textile factories is industrialization. So if you were looking to contextualize this document, you might talk about industrialization. Taking a look, but what's happening? Let's take a deeper look then and see what might be the context, what might have happened in 1835 to explain the change over time that we see here. That's right, yes. So where do we see the child labor laws? When do you think the child labor laws went into effect here? Right. So yeah, women and children did do a lot of this labor, but as you notice, so did men. Sometimes different labor in these factories. Right. So we had that, and women had been doing this work before, right? Less likely to organize. We have that, but what's the change over time that's happening here? Yep. So what do you think happened in 1835? Okay. So 1835, 36, that's when the Factory Act in England and Scotland, UK, went into effect. So that shows that change over time because of that. But as you see, as the men's labor stays pretty stable until we get into the 1860s, right? And there's laws also for women. Notice that you all would be men and women by these definitions. Of course, myself as well. Okay. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at last week's practice. And so that's linked down below on thesis writing. So you can take a peek at the prompt and some of the other responses if you haven't already. A lot of people have looked at it and a lot of people responded. Big thanks to Mrs. Longnecker and Mr. Little for handling so much of the feedback on those. So if you got feedback from one of those people, you might want to, just let them know that you appreciate it. So we'll take a look at that, and then we'll be into our new time period. So that's going to include the key concepts and then the power vocab for this section of it. As you can see, industrialization is the big idea here. And my goal is to I did you, Lee? Yeah, you are welcome, Lee. I did some of them as well. Yeah, it was good. It's really nice reading those. There's no substitute for practice. There's literally no substitute for practice. So, in any case, we'll take a look at that. Now, I find that industrialization is a topic that a lot of students come into my class knowing something about, but just in the nature of schooling, some of you might have had human geography or other U.S. history classes, but we're going to try to take a look at it at a deeper kind of a deeper level here. All right. So I just want to show you a little bit. Now, the thesis, as you see here, is only 1/10 of the exam. That's why it's part of why we didn't start there. The other reason why I didn't start with that for practice is the best way to create your thesis often can be to do it bottom up. Start with the documents and then determine what kinds of arguments that they are creating for you. So we have the same prompt or the same task for this coming week, but with a new set of documents. All right. So here we are. Here was the prompt. So if you didn't see the the prompt was asking this, and there were 5 documents from different empires that were looking at ways they consolidated their power. And I want to use this to make a few points. First of all, the most important thing that you can do with your thesis is to identify. Remember, AP stands for address the prompt. You have to address the prompt. And that's going to mean that you should have some sort of, if the prompt is asking you to evaluate the extent, you need to offer an evaluation to be responding to the prompt. If you have a claim and a counterclaim, that can set up complexity, but by itself, that doesn't address the prompt. You still need to say, like, to what, it's really asking to what degree, how much. So how much did rulers rely on early modern, or how much did they rely on traditional methods of power? And all of these prompts will have an implied counterclaim in them. So you are going to want to determine like how much of the claim versus how much of the implied counterclaim. Here's a way to think of it. If you were to ask me to evaluate the extent to which it might rain tomorrow, and I said it might rain and it might not, I have not really addressed the prompt. Even if I went on to give you all kinds of like other meteorological, reasoning, you have to address the prompt. This was the most common comment that we made. You're much better off having a simple thesis that clearly addresses the prompt and then developing it well than spending a lot of time on a more complex thesis and stumbling. Now, that said, thinking about thinking about counterclaims is that's great because the documents don't all point in one direction. So I really like that people were thinking complexly, that some of the documents point this way, some of them point that way. It's just that maybe when you finish that, then you have to say, you have to bring an adverb into play, like mostly, and I'll show you some examples. And then, so that's the one thing. But then you also have to always explain. And I emphasize the first part more because I felt like in the examples that I looked through, there was more explaining happening, which is good. It's much easier to encourage people to do the simple thing than the complex thing. Okay. So I think some sort of, even like a, Victoria says like majorly, sure. If you can support that. Now, your second thesis, after you get done writing, might have something a little more nuanced to it, but you want to decide, is it, mostly not, or somewhere in the middle? Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look. Here are a couple of examples. Why don't you see if you can find where Ella did her contextualization in this prompt, in this response. So which words are signaling that she is offering an evaluation? And it does go on to lay out some nice examples. Right. Okay. So where are the evaluations happening? Right. Most other countries, very few. Right. Yes, Ella representing NDS. The Notre Dame School of Manhattan they have been active participants, so they've had a lot of members here. But that's because so many students from there are writing in practice and doing quality responses. You are welcome, Ella, and thank you for sharing. So you see that. So what Ella did says the although, and then has although, and then very few to do that. Okay, and then the line of reasoning is there as well. Okay. I'm going to show you one other example from another student. Oh, so this is the line of reasoning then. Okay. All right, let's do the same game here with Gami. And Gami has drafted their response. Let's see if you can find this. Where is the qualifying phrase here? You see the qualifying phrase here. Yeah, there we are. Great, thank you. Looks like Maya has identified it. I'm going to bring a circle onto it here. Okay. So that word dominated is offering an evaluation, that this is still mostly what's happening. Now, obviously, in a 2 to 3 at best body paragraph essay, you're not going to really be able to develop like a percentage, like 63% chance of rain tomorrow kind of precision, but you still want to offer some sort of evaluation. Do you feel like it's mostly one way or mostly another way, and maybe to what degree? And if you feel like it's like literally 50-50, like then just kind of say that. Literally this, this is equally, then you do something like equally. Okay. But overall, I mean, there's the feedback that I was giving, and I saw Mrs. Longnecker and Mr. Little giving, were often very specific things. Like the big ideas that people were laying out there, generally quite good. So I was happy with that. And you can take a look. It's really good to read other students' responses. And then you can click on there's a little thing that will say 1 response or 2 responses. And if you click on that, then it'll show you how somebody responded. Or alternately, when I go to pick out the ones I want to use for here, one of the things I do is I look at the teacher's feedback, and I see what kind of feedback they gave, and I find one where the feedback's super positive, and then I click to see the students. And then I check and see if they're a CRAM student. Okay, for this. All right, now here's the moment we've been waiting for, and this is not related to thesis, but you will be doing thesis again for this coming week. So we'll have more practice with that. So here is our outside evidence, and this was one where concision was the key. And this is, you want to imagine there is just a couple minutes left and you realize you've only used one piece of outside evidence and you're going to squeeze one more in there. And since, if you're typing, you can just go to where it's going to go in the paragraph. If you're writing, you can physically draw an arrow to where you want to put it in. So this student, I believe, has already won CRAM contest one time, but this was so concise, it's almost like a haiku. And yet, it's a complete sentence. So, without further ado, I bring you 81. So if you take a look at that, that is 1 point of outside evidence identifying Dev Sherme, then identifies what it is, recruiting Christian boys, and then explains how it relates to the prompt. Now, I just saw someone comment here that the outside evidence is stressful, and I feel that because sometimes it's like anything when you're trying to remember something, it can be really hard. Like I'm not always 100% sure where my keys are. Well, now, I guess it doesn't matter. But when I'm driving more even, but the more I think about it, the harder it can be to think of it. So let me tell you, say two things about the outside evidence. First of all, if that is harder for you, there are plenty of other points you can pick up by really digging into the documents. So as I mentioned in one of the earlier streams, no one will have enough time to do all the things. Well, it's designed for that not to be typical. So you should start with the things that you do well. Right, the time crunch can really make it hard. So if you find working with the documents easier than thinking of outside evidence, don't worry about outside evidence when you're planning your essay. Just really dig into the documents. Now, conversely, if you do like outside evidence, then you could think about using two documents well, and then really, digging into outside evidence and contextualization and those other kinds of things, kind of writing an LEQ with two extra documents. Remember, if you write two documents really well, the third and fourth document are going to move you from 4 points to 5 points. So if that's what you're strong at, that can help. It might even help with complexity. But if you write two documents well and you'd rather get into outside evidence at that point, then you should do that. So my advice would be to go with your strength. Secondly, just like with me and my keys, sometimes if I think about something different for a few minutes or start, just kind of working through a different process, then it'll come into mind. It's like when we're trying to remember, sometimes it can be counterproductive. So if you just start writing about the documents, then you might find some things that are useful. So here we are. Taking a look here. So practice, if you hit the big green button, you can see the new practice prompt there. And that DBQ is extremely fresh. So if something is confusing, you should feel free to message me because I am working it out. Okay. So I'm going to devote substantial time on Thursday to talking about complexity. But I will say that corroborating qualifying, that is, Neha asks here in the chat, that is what is complex. And the important thing, the reason I want to say that now is that's not in your thesis. That's corroborating or qualifying the evidence. So if you have a claim and a counterclaim, that's cool. But for that to be complexity, it needs to show up when you're doing the documents. Like this shows continuity and it also shows change. So like Elizabeth I granting the charter to the East India Company, that's continuity because rulers trying to use trade to consolidate power, that's a continuity. That's a traditional method. But East India companies, chartered companies, those were new. Okay. So then you want to be doing the claim and counter, showing the limits and stuff within each piece of evidence. All right. But I said I wasn't going to do that. So I'm going to take a look here. And I'm going to pop up the key concepts like I do, and then I'll take a look at the questions for our first question interval. All right, so these are the big ideas, 1750 to 1900. And I'll take a look at what is happening. I'll take a look at the first two questions here. So the first question asks, from Gami, if we interpret all the documents wrong and then make an argument that was opposite of what College Board expected us to, can we still pass the exam? Probably not. So interpreting the documents correctly is what's important. Now, there is not going to be an expected interpretation of the exam. There'll be a range of answers that students might come up with. So if you think about the recent one that we did with the prompt, evaluate the extent to which rulers in the early modern period used traditional methods. It's basically wrong to say that traditional methods were completely abandoned. Like that's not defensible. So the phrasing that's used in the scoring is that your thesis needs to be historically defensible, meaning that it needs to be one of the possible interpretations. Now, if somebody said that traditional methods were very important and someone else said they were not so important, those things are both defensible because it really depends on how it depends on which countries you're using as examples, and it also depends on how you're defining traditional methods and what you're thinking things of being new. So answering the documents correctly is really important, or interpreting the documents correctly. But there's often more than one direction that the documents could point you in. So, and then this will be a common topic. Snigdha asks, what are your guesses for what topic might be on the DBQ this year? I mean, that is a really dangerous game. So I'm going to decline to answer. Go with the polite no comment. I'll say a few things though, just in general. That is that there's a lot of topics that you can probably use either as context. If you look at the key concepts we've been doing, those could be either the topic or they could provide context for a certain time period. I would think that they would look for something that connects regions of the world so that it's global. Usually that gets balanced. So like last year when the DBQ was on the Indian Ocean and the Portuguese, then there were probably fewer Indian Ocean questions elsewhere on the exam. I don't know, but there was probably not a set of questions on the Indian Ocean. So we would we'll see. It's probably going to be connected. It's probably going to be something that's going to be able to connect different parts of the world. So that could involve Europe, but it won't be a question. It won't be a question that you can only answer with, or that's only about one part of the world. Okay. Yeah, no, I got what you meant there. I got what you meant there, Snigdha. So that's my thought. But really, if you guessing what it's going to be, and let me tell you what I would be more confident of than any single guess is that there'll be multiple DBQs out there. That happens in normal years where they're either testing some, or especially with testing security things. One year, some of my kids did one and other kids of mine did a different one. So you all might take you won't all take different ones. There won't be 400 different DBQs, but there might be 5. So, okay. I am going to come back to these questions later so you can look at them and upvote and see what's happening. So let's take a look. So the key concepts, if you want to see the whole text of the key concepts, instead of putting that up on the screen because it's too much text for the screen, there is a link to a document. The icon looks like a folder, and that has the full text from the College Board. The College Board really changed the industrial capitalism one, and I changed it back a little bit. So just know that. But the other 3 are the same. And then there's also some charts like we've used that you could copy. So it's a Google Doc. So if you wanted to copy it to make your own chart. So one thing you can do is to sort of think about things you know from this time period. Like you think steam engine, and then kind of where does that go? What topic, what region? And then thinking that could either be evidence or context. Okay, so the document is underneath me and the screen. It says resources for this stream, and there's a bunch. There's some links that go to different things, including the practice prompts. And then there's a document, and it says something like modern era practice. And the icon is a folder, like, would be like in a folder. Another way that you can start to review now too is to start thinking about time periods, like things that you know and which time period would they go into. If you find that you're struggling with outside evidence and you want to know some more things, that might be a good place now to start doing a few Quizlet decks to get some specific things down. But then when you finish the deck, you want to like take a few minutes and then look at something like this and think, what do you remember? And then put those things in a chart like this. Or if you have 3 charts for 3 different time periods, you could have a literate member of your family, could be younger, could be older, literate member of your family, quiz you and like tell you something from your chart, and then you have to say, which time period it's from. Okay. So if you have any questions about the unit, you can put those in there. Then we'll take a look at this week's power vocabulary. Now, like I said, it would be good to start memorizing a few specific pieces of information, especially things you already know. But the most important things to know that are Frayer card worthy are going to be things that are words that are used to explain other things. So let's take a look at the power vocabulary for the industrialization frame. Okay. So you should know what this means. And that's the main topic. And we started talking about capitalism in the last couple of streams, last 3, I guess. And now we're going to see what it means when capitalism is industrial. So that is like understanding what that means. And as I've said, capitalism means more than just like, free markets and private ownership. That's part of it, but it is about investment and profit. So just to kind of keep attention to that little more sophisticated definition of capitalism. So consumer goods then are different than capital goods. Consumer goods are things that people buy, like stuff that a final product, as opposed to something that a business owner might buy in order to produce things. And then this period also produced lots of efforts at reform, and some of that, what's reform, what's revolution, we'll kind of see. So we already saw that a little bit with the Factory Act and legislation in England. All right, so let's take a look here and get some guesses. What do you think what do you think about this? Which things does it show? And I see some course and exam description comments there. Basically, what I've done in these streams is tried to unpack the CED for you. So, I mean, I wouldn't ever discourage anyone from taking a look, but it's really, in its current form, is really designed for teachers. But just so you know, like those key concepts come from the CED. These power vocabulary words come from the CED. So I've really tried to do that. All right. This is called The Strike, and it's a pretty famous painting. It's been in at least one textbook I've used. Yeah, now this one we can probably see different things. So if you see something, you could say where you think it might be, and then think what's happening here in this image. There we are. Yep, I think, is it in Traditions and Encounters, Mr. Little? I don't know if it's there or if it was in the copy of the AP Euro book I used, but it's there. So I looked up a little bit on this, and it's interesting. This is this guy's only famous painting. It's not based on a particular event. This was a product of his imagination, but he painted it shortly before the Haymarket affair, which was conflict over the 8-hour workday. So that was the big topic here. Bentley and Ziegler, right on. Okay, that's where I got it. I've seen it. I like it. It might have been in McKay too. Yeah, so Tanya asked, who's the guy in the top hat? So what is that showing? Right, so we're seeing these different things. I think you can't really see consumer goods here, but I think you can see kind of the other things. All right, thank you, Dallas. All right. Next picture. This I've seen. There's a few. This is not my picture, but 14 years ago, I did a summer program for American history teachers in England on the Industrial Revolution. Great time. And I've seen this particular thing here. So what is that? Yeah, if you think it's industrial production, like what is it? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, right. Steam engine. That's right, Victoria. This is a steam engine. Now, it's not a consumer good because consumer goods would be something that people would buy, consumers. So this is something that a business would buy. You would call this this is a capital good. It's the first steam engine that was used. It's very inefficient. It was used for like on a railroad. It went 10 miles between like a coal pit, a coal mine, and someplace else. And it was called Locomotion Number One, which is an outstanding name. And then, of course, the word locomotive eventually comes from that. No, consumer good would be something that's purchased. And so one of the things that we saw in the last period was that industriousness revolution, as artisans and peasant laborers around the world were working more than they had before to earn a little bit of money so that they could buy things. And those things would be consumer goods. And that could be a piece of nice cloth from somewhere else or a porcelain dish, something like that. Yep, textiles. Often the answer. Speaking of which, no, a good and a service are different, but the same process of marketization, like the transition from human beings making most of what they needed and used in their own homes to mostly that not happening and people purchasing things on the market will be related to the rise of services. All right, what do you think is being produced here? This picture is in Japan, and it's from the end of the time period. Yeah, what kind of textiles? It's not porcelain, although there might be porcelain dishes involved. Yep, so these would be things. I didn't just include this because I thought Vishal would be here from Japan tonight, but it is a nice coincidence. So you see here, right? Yeah, it's not cotton, but there was a lot of cotton manufacturing in a rosa for the win with silk. What are these women unrolling? So you look into the picture. I think this is a very nice photograph too. I kind of like it. So those are silkworm cocoons. Yeah, it is silk. There you go, Neha. Yeah, it's not the worms, although some worms were killed in the making of this silk. The worm does not fare well in silk production. So here we are. And I like this picture because it shows how the transition to industrial production is gradual. It's not all or nothing. It's complex. So you see here we have these young women doing something that young women would have done in Japan for centuries as part of artisanal or home production labor, and but with their hands. But then in the background you have but then in the background you have like the spindles and the mechanized thread, right? Yeah, there are dishes. There's silk cocoons in that, right? Well, I think there are some similarities with English industrialization where there was a cottage industry of woolen production, and the first factories are people, they just gathered together, people working with their hands as a way to organize their production more. So you have that tradition. So the idea that children are working in factories is not that different from children having to do productive labor in cottages or farms. So there's continuity and change there. In Japan, there's more of a gradual transition, and that's sometimes presented in textbooks. All right, how about this? Now, this is from earlier in the century, earlier in the period, beginning of the 19th century. That other picture, I think, is from just after 1900. Well, Maya, if you have the picture, then it's not beyond the documents because it is a document. Are you asking? Maybe I saw your question out of context. Yeah, so what are the consumer goods here for other people? All right, Neha's answering your question. All right, carry on. Thank you, Neha. Right. Yeah, so there's some women in this picture. And so back here we had women who were working. Well, these women what are they doing? Yeah, right. This is they're shopping, right? They're shopping for goods. This is the other end. So this is one of the first department stores. I found this image Googling, 1800s department stores. This is from London in 1807. So it's an early department store just catering to, middle or upper income people. You see the women are being waited on to be like a high-end department store. Right. So Gami says middle class. So the growth of the middle class is going to contribute to this consumer culture, which is going to encourage more manufacturing, which is going to create more lower class jobs, but also more middle class jobs, and that'll lead to more consumption. It's in London, and this is a early London department store. So all these goods. Now, these might not be factory goods yet because it's in 1807. That's pretty early in the English factories. I don't know if they were using a lot of cotton yet. And this stuff looks like you don't go to a shop like this to put a wool dress on, which is, what the English would have been a law for. So these might still be artisanal cloths from Asia that are being shipped there, but London's a big entrepot of the world. Well, it's not cloth production. What we're seeing here is cloth consumption, the other end of it. They're buying it. Right? So that you can go in there, and then maybe you could probably contract. This would be where services come in, somebody to make a nice dress out of these things for you. Okay. Another picture for you. Yeah. So what do you think we see here in this picture, and how might it fit in? Yeah, it could be. What do you think they're doing? It is capitalism. Thank you, Jude. But I mean, they're all more than one thing. They're not directly producing. Do you know what the women in this picture are doing? Look what they have. Spinning jennies were mostly used in the home, and then later some were collected into factories, a bunch of people spinning there together. That was replaced with, powered things. Yeah, counting is closer. Yeah, I don't think they're probably making too much money. Nope, these are women, and what they're doing, they have to have their hair up. It looks like there's some kind of a dress code. It's not sewing machines, but that's what you might guess. I mean, I know what it is because I found it, but they're typing. These are typing machines, typewriters. So that you have to they're typewriters. Yeah, they have to push down on. And so this shows us what offices would have looked like and the large numbers of like lower middle class jobs that capitalism would create too. Yeah, it could be accounting, banking. They might be writing contracts. They have a list of things, like somebody would handwrite what they want typed and then hand it to them. So it would be kind of like what we used to call the secretarial pool. But what this shows us is the scale of business. So again, capitalism isn't just about buying and selling things. It's about the scale that starts to happen. That there's so many sales and contracts and accounts that you need a whole room full of women typing to keep up with the correspondence. Right. It's also, Jason has the organization is a key part of this. That it's like that capitalism isn't just about dumping a whole bunch of money at a problem. It's like using capital to get and organizing people to create the greatest return on investment. Okay. So let's take a look then at some of these topics in a little more organized fashion. So this will be one of the first things. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time here on context, both as a way to practice contextualization, but also as a way to kind of think about industrialization in like a world history context. And then also you do the reverse, because industrialization is the context for a lot of other things. And so kind of thinking in that way. So I think it is very important, and this is sometimes underemphasized in textbooks, and it is certainly underemphasized in the CED, if you check that out, how the colonialism was the key, or one of the keys. There's multiple keys. There's now never just one cause of things. But colonialism and the Britain, for example, having colonies is a big part of how they industrialize. Oh, I'm sorry. The CED is the course and exam description. Jude asked there, and I saw some kids mentioning it in the chat. You don't need to know what that is. If you were to look at it, it's okay, but you don't need to know what that is. So that's a little teacher talk slipped in there. Right. So this shows Kiki's got the imperialism there. It shows the earlier imperialism, which leads into the later imperialism, and that's going to be a part of capitalist industrialism in a few different ways. First of all, if capitalism is investment, there needs to be accumulation of money, and the profits from the slave trade and sugar especially produced profits that were then available to be invested in other industries. So the excessive profit that colonialism allowed did that. Now, we're not to the scramble for Africa part yet, so this is still, I mean, it's going to kind of come in, but this is, I'm kind of thinking about at the beginning of industrialization, how Britain's colonial empire, the profits, especially in Britain from the trade in trafficked enslaved people, how the profits from that led to the investments in capital goods like machines and factories that allowed for, that was necessary for industrialization. Plus, it created this global market. One of the things too that could happen is, despite people talking about free trade during this time period, during imperialism, like people in Jamaica were mostly enslaved, but the people who were purchasing things for them to wear and eat were often bounded by the regulations of the empire. The same thing will be true as the East India Company gets more control over that. Now, Daleth is right that the trade's freer, but what I'm suggesting here in terms of complexity is that when mercantilism ends, there's still, because of colonialism, there's still a lot of restrictions on like who can buy and sell what in different places. So we shouldn't think of that again as just disappearing, and a lot of the mercantile stuff is just to allow people from within the same country to compete, but they're still, like Britain is still making it illegal to take out plans for textile factories. They're still barring imports of certain kinds of Indian-made cloth. That's why so much of that stuff gets re-exported. Some of it can come in, but not all of it. There's still a lot of regulation that's benefiting people. Well, it depends on what you think of the purpose of free trade as, Dolph. I think the way free trade gets talked about in American schools a lot, it's this idealized version. So you can think of it this way. Businesses want to be able to trade freely themselves, but they don't want to have to compete with too many other people. So when somebody so if you take it back to the Dutch, when they went to the East Indies to get spices, they didn't want to compete with other people to purchase the spices. So they forced Southeast Asian people to only sell to them under threat of violence. But then when they went to Europe, they wanted there to be a competitive market for goods, because then people would pay a lot of money for rare spices. So one of the things is the way capitalism works as a system in an ideal sense is not the way actual capitalists behave. Additionally, the governments are always trying to serve they're always trying to serve the powerful people in their society who can profit. Okay, I don't want to go off too much onto this because then it's too complex, isn't helpful either. But just know that colonialism created profits, and it created places where businesses could sell their goods, and those things were both important for early industrialization. Okay. Secondly, we talked about this last week. I've already mentioned this, but the increasing production, agricultural production, and also cottage industry, and on the left we see Japan, on the right Britain, those things created the context where capital was also being accumulated, like profits, and people were starting to work for wages, and there was enough food so more people could work in factories. So those things all created, that also created the condition for this. Okay. You may not be able to read this text, but this is an illustration of one of the first British iron mills that was making iron using coke from coal instead of charcoal, and water wheel production. So they're producing it at an industrial scale. And so it kind of shows some of that technology. So iron is one of the key things. Now I have this picture in here because we saw a picture a little bit like it, less detailed, from China, from like, I don't know, 500 years earlier, 400 years earlier than this one. And so that's, again, a way of thinking that the basic ingredients for industrialization were present in more than one part of the world. And so there's multiple factors that lead to it happening first in Britain. So you should know that it's in Britain, and you should know that it could have happened in other places, but it did happen in Britain. The Bessemer process comes later and is much larger in scale. You can see here down at the bottom, that's pig iron, because it's like piglets by a mother pig laying there, and that's where the iron's coming out in these kind of smaller quantities. When you see a Bessemer converter, it's gigantic. All right, so you should know that that industrialization is something that starts in Britain. And yep, Dallon's got it. Bessemer for steel. And steel had been made before, but it's just made in much larger quantities. Vulcanization is rubber. Oh no, it's okay. You're practicing, and there might be times where you wouldn't have to differentiate between those things. So the earliest part of industrialization involved coal and textile and iron, and you can see some examples of that here. To answer your question, Nihai asked, so we have to know the specifics of these. No, but it's the kind of situation where you might use one as a piece of evidence. Okay. Where you might use one. So someone might talk about the Bessemer process and steel, and somebody else might talk about vulcanization of rubber, and each kid might not know about the other thing, and they're both fine. Right. Yep, I know the books like represent these geographic dynamics as important, but you should know those things are true in other places. Like Poland also has iron and coal and rivers. So there's more things happening than that. But you're right. Those are factors you can talk about. Okay. Here's a steam engine. These two things are reversed. This is what they originally looked like. And they were originally designed to pump water out of mines. The second industrial revolution then is when we start to get, when things get much, much bigger. So on the top right there, that's a Bessemer converter. You can see the guy in the blue shirt there, he's 6'5". He's a very tall dude. So like, that's a big converter. And the steelmaking plant down there underneath that picture has 18 different had 18 different Bessemer converters. So it's just much greater production of steel. You don't necessarily have to know how it works. But just knowing that leads to more steel. People have been making steel since ancient times. Steel is just iron plus carbon, a little more than iron you can twist, and a little less than cast iron. So you can make small batches of steel, but this is like huge quantities. So, no, the second industrial revolution would happen in all those places. But the second industrial revolution refers to these different industries, changes in these other industries happening. Okay, but most countries that industrialized did kind of go through that textile phase in order to make the capital then to produce these other goods. Well, yeah, Russia is not as industrialized as Germany, but it's more industrialized than other places like China that neighbors it. So Russia does industrialize some, and Russia's really large. So the fact that Russia was less industrial as a society still meant that there was a lot of industry there. Like if the Russian economy was 10% industry, and then a smaller country was 20% industry, Russia might still have more industry because of the size. But that's generally speaking true that Russia industrialized later than the other big European countries. So you just want to kind of think that, again, that there's different phases to this. Yeah, Mr. Little's got it there in the chat. Semi-industrialized. There are industries. Okay. All right. So what does industrial capitalism mean then in terms of mass production, in terms of production? Well, investment in productive technologies means that there's going to be more goods. And so that's going to have a variety of effects. It's going to lower prices because there's more of the goods. That's going to allow more people to buy things. In fact, in Britain, during this time period, wages are consistently going down during the 1850s, which is something that Karl Marx predicted. But he also predicted that workers in England then would get more miserable, but they didn't because the prices of goods went down. Doesn't mean to say that their lives were great, but it does mean to say that their living standards did not go down in the same way their wages did because things became cheaper to buy. So we have that. Businesses that couldn't purchase the capital goods needed to produce things that could sell cheaply then were driven out of business. Right. So we have that. Okay. This will also have effects in terms of connecting people, both by transportation and ideas. The map in the middle there shows transoceanic telegraph cables, which existed by the 1860s. And by the time we get to 1900, cotton buyers in India are getting, prices from cotton purchase, from the American South, basically in real time. So it's not quite like the internet, but it's you have these connections. Plus, interior regions, because of railroads, get more connected to coasts. Right. All right. Let me just kind of pause here and see. There's some questions. We just have a few minutes, and I want to be sure I get to the questions. Maybe I'll take a look here at this next picture to give you something to look at while I'm looking at the things. We've already talked about some of these things. There's a lot of text there, so you can check it out. I'll probably just do a couple questions. All right. So Lee asks a common question here, which is how do we clearly yet eloquently link outside evidence to our claim? By saying this shows? Well, I think that's okay, but that's definitely more clear than eloquent. So, but I think that's okay. Because remember, what you're writing isn't an essay that's going to be graded holistically, where someone's going to be like, oh, is this a nice piece of writing? A lot of historians are very good writers. This history is about taking evidence from the past and creating a coherent narrative or story or analysis with it. But in this rough draft situation, you could do that. You could also use things like also. You could also use things like also, meaning you could be talking about something and say the Janissaries were also an example of this. The Janissaries, and then like who they were. Christian boys recruited often from the Balkans, trained in the military, were also an example of increased military power because. So an example of or illustrates. You can do it like that. You just want to be sure that you're identifying something and then you're using it to show how, as an example of one of the main points that you're adapting. Okay, so don't be afraid of being too clear and not eloquent enough. But as you practice it, you might be able to come up with some better phrases. And when you're writing, I bet some pretty neat stuff will just kind of roll out. Okay. All right, here's another question about linking. To link and describe the documents to the prompt. Because when I was practicing, I felt like I was just rewording everything the document said. So I don't know what it would be like to get the prompt. I'm sure that is a question that other students have, Juliana, and I appreciate that you asked that there. So what you want to do is to remember, you can start by remembering one thing, and that is that the document was not written to answer the question that we're using it for. So you have to see what the document's saying, but then you want to draw a conclusion from it. Like, what does this tell us in relationship to the prompt? So the document, some of the documents that we have in the DBQ that I put together over the last couple of days, the people are complaining. So their purpose is to complain, to try to change things. But the fact that they are complaining also tells us something. So it's kind of like big picture. It's kind of like big picture, what was happening. Or big picture, like what does the document show about the time period? Sorry, let me rephrase that again. So what does the document show about the time period, and then how do you relate that to the prompt? One thing you can do is just keep asking yourself, why is this important? And you should also know the other piece of advice I would give for students with this question is that you're not going to have to use the whole document, and oftentimes you won't. Sometimes that's what complexity can mean, where you're looking at different parts of the document, but you won't always have time for that. So if you're just looking to master the straightforward using the document as evidence, let yourself know you won't have to use the whole thing. It might just be that somebody actually said this is enough, or it could be the main idea, or it could just be one piece of what they're saying. So think about it as using a piece of it to support your claim. And you can start that process by thinking about the prompt while you're reading the document. So that's why I think it's a good idea. And then Mrs. Longacre's really helped me think about a good format for this, with a piece of paper or another tab. When you're reading the document, before you read the next document, record in like 4 words or less, what does this show? And then use those words to write your thing, and then refer back to the document. 5 words or less, something like that. Like, make it kind of artificially short. Okay. I'll do one more here. Rosa asks, what's the difference between colonialism and imperialism? I would say in general, you can think of them as the same thing. They have different connotations in different situations, but I think for our purposes, we can think of them as the same thing. Imperialism as a word kind of takes the imperialist's point of view on the situation, like creating an empire. So you think of British imperialists are British people who are creating an empire. Whereas colonialism is a more holistic term because it brings the experiences of colonized people more readily into it. So I did answer it, but using them as synonyms is going to work fine in AP World History. All right, I'll take a look at this again at the end, and let's just take a quick look here. So capitalism creates these new social classes because now you have people working for wages, and they only have a wage relationship, getting paid money in exchange for their labor with the people they work for. So it breaks up traditional social bonds in that way. And they're often at first very disciplined. The first factories were produced to really regulate people. You might have seen some of those documents, like the rules that that factories put out about when people could show up and what they could do. You might have learned about, like in the United States, the Triangle Factory Fire, where the people are locked in there. So a lot of it's about disciplining laborers, and you can kind of see that here in these pictures. So those class differences, those new social classes, can lead to different class conflicts. And there's a couple different dimensions that can take. Trade unions and political parties often would represent fairly narrow groups of people. So on the bottom left there, those are Australian railroad workers. And so they're probably working to try to get a better wage for themselves. They might cooperate with other workers, they might not. And then they might, when men got the right to vote in countries like Britain and Australia and the United States, by the end of the century in these industrializing countries, most men can vote. And so working people start to vote for parties that are going to protect their interests as workers, and often protecting unions. So that would be reform. On the right, we see the more revolutionary idea that the workers from all over the world should unite together to smash the capitalist system. And so that's communism, or a milder version of that would be socialism. So you kind of see those two different things can be really distinct in that way. And if we were doing 20th century history, then we would get more into that. But creating new social classes leads to new kinds of conflicts and negotiation. All right, so this picture here also shows us reform, and this relates to the laws regulating child labor. And you might not be able to read it, but I'll have the slides up when I post the replay. And I'll have the replay up before I go to bed, and I'll do the timestamps tomorrow morning. That's pretty much what I'll do to see the timestamps in there. But if you want to see the replay, it'll be up soon. Then you can maybe zoom in. But this shows like a report by inspectors who were looking at factories to inspect to see if they're following the child labor laws. So this shows another way of reform, so to prevent those conflicts from getting too big, so having government regulations. Okay. The last thing I'll say here is that industrial capitalism and the state, and some people brought this up, this word laissez-faire that came up last week, there can be kind of a paradox here. And that is originally laissez-faire, as people guessed or knew in the chat, is about getting rid of all the different mercantilist restrictions on trade. And a lot of those created monopoly companies within countries. So like in places like Britain, there was the Salt Company. There was, the East India Company. It wasn't a monopoly in terms of who could buy stuff in the East Indies, because that was, there was a lot of people buying stuff there. But the East India Company was the only people who could sell goods from the East Indies in England. So breaking that up. Now, capitalists, when they start to form, they advocate for laissez-faire because they want to be able to buy and sell with the market. But you should know it's more of a slogan than a reality, because, like I said, they still want lots of things from the government. And that doesn't just mean like building roads, although that's a big deal, or building ports, although that's a big deal, but enforcing, creating currency, enforcing laws, enforcing private property. Like without the government, you can't have capitalism, because you need something to protect the private property. So you should know that, but it doesn't mean you should toss out, so it's complicated. So laissez-faire means trying to compete freely, and it's used as a slogan by businesses who don't want to be hampered in what they're doing. Yeah, the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation in the chat, that's going to bring a lot of these things together. All right, so here's what's happened. I've gone on a bit, and we answered some questions, so I'm not going to do the rest of the slides so we don't go too long. They will be in the thing that's posted, and I'll put them in the Imperialism stream for next week. On Thursday, we're doing revolutions, and I'm also going to maybe have a little more question time in that stream. So if you have any other questions that you'd like me to address, let's go ahead and put those in there. So I'll stop the narration here and just do questions. So you can upvote or add questions. I see there's a few, and I won't be able to get to all of them. And if you do need to go, of course, that's always fine. All right. Will you write a DBQ in the 5-hour? Well, let me go ahead. So Dan asked if we're going to write a DBQ in the 5-hour CRAM finale. No, we won't do that, because I know that Amanda Duamaral, the Queen of Five, well, she's doing the human geo streams, and she was doing that last time they crashed the Google Doc. So we had, lots of people here tonight, and there's a chance they're selling, the admission to that for $5. There just won't be the space. So there won't be the space for us to do that. So we're going to have 2 more practice prompts out there. And I would also encourage you to peer review each other's stuff. Some of you are connected now to each other, or you're connected through your school, or you're connected through your Olympics teaming, and you can respond to each other there and take a look and see and polish some things together. It's really just not feasible, because that's going to be like a mass gathering. But we'll have a stream on Tuesday next week, a week from tonight, that'll be more like usual, and we'll go over the examples like we do. Oh, yeah, no, peer review is a good way to get better at things. That's a good way to get better at things, Dan. Okay. All right. So Snigda is wondering he asked a question which is not common, not just for you. He said this question seems to be a common one for me among several documents. And then I'm just going to say, it's not just you, it's all these things. How do we know what to make of a picture if the image seems unclear? Well, I'm going to give you two answers here. The first one is that you should read the sourcing line. When I was giving you those images before without captions, that's just a practice looking at the details of the picture, the kinds of things you might use as evidence, much like you might refer to a piece of a writing. When you're using it as evidence, you might refer to a piece of a picture. But you should know that on the DBQ, there'll be a source description there. And students who are successful often read that source description very, very closely. And sometimes the source description itself is more useful than the picture. So I'll just say that. Secondly, you don't have to use all the documents. Last year, the picture on the DBQ was very hard for students to use. Very few students used it. Like, I know Mr. Lassiter, who's done some streams here, and I linked his stream on thesis writing below as a replay, which you might appreciate. He graded last year's DBQ, and I don't know what he said, but it was like 1% of kids he felt like used the picture. So just know if one of the pictures is really hard to use, there's only going to be one. You can still use the other 4 documents. So those are both kind of workarounds. And then it's just another question of what's your strength. You know, for some students, the visual sources are their strength, but certainly not for everybody. And so if you're stronger with the textual sources, well then, you know, dig into those more. Okay. And now these other questions, I don't know how to answer. There's a question in here about your AP ID. I'm not sure. That would be something you should ask your AP coordinator at your school, whoever that might be. I'm going to answer this question, though. That'll be my last question. Okay, so this question here, Ethan asks, is there a potential that the prompt will have something to do with the deadly pandemics and such like the Black Plague, or is that unrealistic? Well, I guess that's possible. I would think I wouldn't think that that's probable for a couple reasons. The first one is the situation is still affecting people in very different ways. So for some people, like I know my family, we're fortunate. We haven't been affected directly. I'm able to do my job from home okay. So is my wife. My daughter doing 3rd grade at home is okay. You know, but we're fine. But for other people, there's people who've lost family members, there's people whose lives have been really disrupted, might include some of you who are listening. And so the College Board is going to kind of shy away from something that might be traumatic for some of the students, because that really is kind of a fairness issue. Also, you should know that they work on these DBQs for years, like they start developing them. So they've probably taken some that were in development and they're tweaking them for this format, take out 2 documents, maybe change the prompt a little bit to make them fit. So like if this hadn't happened, like if we didn't have the disruption from COVID-19, the DBQ that you would be getting would have been written like a year ago and waiting to be used at a different time, because on the actual exam, they have to fit the DBQ in terms of its content and time period and scale in with all the other things, so that there's not too much of one area or too much of one time period, or not enough of a certain theme, so like that. So they wouldn't have written a brand new one just when this happened, and I think they might be sensitive to what's happening. Now, that said, a lot of us have learned a lot more about disease, how diseases affect society, the history of disease. I know I have over the past 2-3 months. And so there's lots of opportunities to apply that as outside evidence or ways to show complexity. Okay. All right, I'm going to close that there, but you all have ways of contacting us on the community, or you can email me with questions, and I would encourage you just to practice. I know I was just kind of rambling while this other conversations were going on in the chat, but really, you all are going to be fine. The fact that you're here and practicing, there is nothing more important than practicing. I said this in the first stream. I'm going to say it again. There is no single fact that you have to know to get a 5 on the AP exam. So if some student knows something that you don't know, you could both still do very, very well. So practice, analyze your documents, add a few facts into your charts, just kind of keep building on what you have. I really enjoy the energy from all of you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again on Thursday for revolutions, which is really, honestly, maybe my favorite topic. So I'm pretty excited. See you soon. Thanks for coming.